Mr. Speaker, the Protection from Scams Bill is the government's latest legislative effort in its efforts to tackle the scourge of scams, which, as we all know, almost doubled between 2022 and 23 and amounted to more than 650 million in losses. The key idea embedded in the bill is the granting of powers to issue restriction orders, or ROs, to banks to stop transactions as a last-ditch effort by the police to prevent what has clearly been adjudged to be a scam. I will make two main points. First, given the eroding distinction between fraud and scams, I wonder whether the definition of scams covered by the bill alone is sufficient. Second, in light of how the bill represents a significant intrusion into private transactions, I wonder if there's room to further constrain the specific application of ROs. Let me start by explaining how many observers perceive a difference between frauds and scams. Fraud, for them, is a result of deception. A malicious actor obtains personal information without the victim's knowledge or consent and proceeds to use said information for financial gain. Scams, in contrast, occur when an unwitting victim is manipulated to either release such information voluntarily or, in the most egregious cases, abet the process altogether with active cash transfers or withdrawals. As observers, we are often inclined to place the blame for fraud on the provider and scams on the consumer. Hence, we think of how financial institutions or telecommunications companies can step up their surveillance of fraudulent schemes or ads, or to plug security holes in their back-end systems, or to contain fraudulent activity. This has indeed been the focus of the Shared Responsibility Framework, or SRF, where guidelines underscore how the duties and responsibilities of the bank or telco tend to be limited to actions taken when fraudulent activity is detected and ascertained. If the consumer subsequently authorizes the transaction, however, then these institutions tend to be absolved of their share of any losses, since they would have already undertaken reasonable steps to stop said transactions. Now, there is often less sympathy for those who fall victim to scams. Many claim that victims are either too naive, or too greedy, or too callous. Surely, if they had simply stepped back and thought through the moment more carefully, they would not fall prey to wily scammers. Or worse, they're frequently viewed as willing, if unwitting, participants who should be punished to learn their lesson. They need to recognize that 20-year-olds who connect with 80-year-olds, if they truly are even 20-year-olds, aren't really there because of true love. Or that it isn't possible to double your money in the span of a few months by lending it to a cash-strapped entrepreneur, returns guaranteed. The problem, however, is that this distinction, while appealing in theory, is both artificial and misleading in practice. Let me offer a few real-life examples to illustrate my point. Those holding credit or debit cards may have inadvertently used them at a terminal with a skimmer installed, or expose their card to radio frequency identification devices. The card then gets cloned, and the clone is either used directly to make purchases, or the relevant information is sold on the dark web. Syndicates have also become sophisticated in testing the waters, effecting one or two small transactions that could easily be missed in a sea of transactions, or by sending packages to the actual address. Verified live cards are then used for large purchases, usually in foreign jurisdictions with weak scammer laws. Has the consumer truly been defrauded here, as one would argue, since they never approved the purchases? Or is it more akin to a scam, since it could be argued that their indifference in response to the testing transactions implies their acquiescence to the larger scheme? As another example, consider an investment scam disseminated as an ad through a social media platform. The scammer would have paid for the ad, and in many cases, an ad that is targeted at a potentially vulnerable demographic. And the text of the ad may well include disclaimer language about the opportunity. So it seems straightforward. Surely someone who invests in, say, a villa in Cambodia or a business in Thailand understands the associated risks. But these scammers do not always propose overt gambles of this nature. In our Meet the People session, we've encountered residents that were duped by offers of, say, a tour in Malaysia offered at a discount, or the promise of a job which involves a specialized pre-training for a fee. From the vantage of the social media platform, these may well seem legitimate. And, unsurprisingly, the social media company would have a financial incentive to classify them as such. Yet, when revealed to be a scam, the provider is often reluctant or outright refuses to take down the ad. Now, is this a scam or a fraud? It exploits the victim's desire to secure a good deal or a job, which makes it closer to a scam. Yet, it embeds elements of deception, such as hidden fine print or bait and switch tactics, which make them more akin to fraud. Of course, there's yet another third possibility, often cited by defenders of the status quo, that scammers may pose as victims to try to defraud financial institutions. Such conspiracies are, of course, criminal. But what if the line between collaborating to deceive and a plea for assistance is far less clear? We are certainly acquainted with cases where, in the name of love or compassion, someone is asked to help with hospital expenses for a friend or their child. Is this a scam or a cry for help or something in between? And while it is an empirical question whether such activities are actually as widespread as feared or would become so if a more robust consumer protection regime were put in place, it is nevertheless true that practices of this nature tend to blur the line between scams and fraud, and the sort of give and take that is common to human relationships. The artificial line between frauds and scams therefore places an even more pressing onus on the formulation of laws that adequately protect Singaporeans from the scourge of both. We should not simply default to the necessary but absolutely insufficient calls for consumers to simply exercise more cyber hygiene while standing pat with more robust legislation. So related, the current treatment of scams in the ambit of the law appears imperfect. Scams are often defined in the schedule, as offences falling under sections 416A, 417, 418, 419, 420, 420A, and B of the Penal Code 1871. Now we can cross-reference this against the guidelines issued by the Sentencing Advisory Panel for scam-related offences, which touch on sections 51 and 55A of the Corruption, Drugs, Trafficking and Other Serious Crimes Act, sections 8A and B of the Computer Misuse Act, and section 420 of the Penal Code. The overlap is section 420 of the Penal Code. Now, if we treat this as encompassing the full scope of how scams will be addressed by this proposed law, then the sort of scams that would trigger the issuance of restriction orders are those associated specifically with cheating behavior. The key question then is whether this definition is sufficient for prosecuting the sort of scams experienced in the real world, given the examples that I've cited above. After all, as already mentioned, scams could be designed such that the fraud intent is neither immediately evident or is somehow justifiable. Love, job, and investment scams could be framed as genuine pursuits, with the perpetrator even undertaking actions, such as disclaimers to risky investments or a nominal amount of useless training, or providing a genuine medical bill that would justify the request for money and its subsequent transfer. Furthermore, the most successful scams often involve confidence-building measures that exploit known weaknesses in human psychology or emotion, to an extent that the scammed victims may even refuse to acknowledge or believe that they are being duped, even when the scam may appear evident to external parties. Undoubtedly, this is one of the focuses of the present bill, yet many remain well in denial after the fact or refuse to face losses head on. Is this cheating anymore? Or or if an individual truly wishes to proceed with an action, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary, is this indeed something that constitutes cheating? When even experts and professionals that do this for a living may be duped, how can we be assured that the police will have special insight or clarity in advance into what does or does not constitute a scam? Will the RO only be activated when the police is able to successfully peg the case to a known scammer or organization? Now, if we accept this inherent uncertainty, how will we be certain that ROs will also be effective in circumstances where scammers are not immediately recognized, especially in an age of artificial intelligence, where the online signature of a potential scammer may easily be masked by extreme personalization and customization, otherwise known as deep phishing? What if the 30-day freeze period activated by Clause 5 of the bill simply postpones the inevitable, with the knowledge that a scam victim plans to remain resolute in their insistence on the monetary transfer, ultimately undermine the intent, the good-natured intent of the law? To be clear, existing laws and regulations are always going to be somewhat incomplete, which is precisely why efforts like the current bill are necessary. Even if we focus more narrowly on the notion of fraud, the existing framework offers scant protection for the consumer. This is a matter that the Workers' Party has previously spoken up about. In particular, we believe that the way that SRF doles out the burden for dealing with scams and frauds remains incomplete at best and ineffectual at worst. For instance, the responsibilities of telcos in the SRF are currently only limited to text via short message via SMSs, perhaps due to known vulnerabilities in that system. But can telcos do more? After all, I'm sure that many of us have received calls from what appears to be local numbers, fishing for details in a foreign accent. If indeed these are locally registered numbers rather than spoofed ones, and these numbers have previously been reported to Scam Shield, could the police use registration documentation to preemptively pursue these scammers? Moreover, scams are often disseminated via alternative communications channels such as WhatsApp messages, social media posts or ads as mentioned previously, and direct messages on social media platforms. So while phishing texts that seek to prod potential victims into clicking through malicious links or fake websites do indeed exist, the more nefarious scamming attempts of late are reliant on social engineering and establishing relationships, much more scam than fraud. Perhaps more concerning is how the SRF relieves financial institutions from solely bearing the burden of fraud so long as they fulfill a checklist of seemingly reasonable actions. This include instituting cooling off periods, real-time notifications of risky transactions, a self-reporting tool for freezing accounts, and a fraud detection system. These are surely valuable measures, but they cannot cover reasonable eventualities where the customer does not appear to be very much at fault at all. One example, based on an experience that I believe many in this house would share, is when a resident encounters an unrecognized transaction in their account. Typically, when they discover such charges to their credit card or debit cards, they would simply call the bank. The institution would typically freeze the card, issue a new one, and perform an investigation into the matter, after which, in most instances, the errant transaction would be struck off. Unfortunately, when the charge is on a debit card, things get far more complicated. In principle, such transactions would have required some sort of additional PIN verification, which would make fraud far more unlikely. But the rise of contactless payments, as mentioned by my friend, Mr. Gerald Yam, means that the embedded RFID chip in the card performs the same security function, which negates the need for any additional PIN. This has permitted fraud of this nature to emerge via RFID skimming. While the cardholder could certainly take additional steps to protect their phone or cards from such skimming attempts, to me, it is a stretch to claim that the fault solely lies with the customer and that they should bear the full burden of such unauthorized transactions. As another example, consider how many banks deal with unrecognized transactions that are reported. The process will usually entail a freeze and an investigation, as I explained earlier. But the investigation itself is opaque, and I'm sure members will also have residents that have reported erroneous transactions expeditiously, only to be subsequently told that the appeal was unsuccessful and they would need to carry the costs of such charges, even if they have no clue as to how they incurred them. As a final example, think about how often we receive calls from individuals claiming to be officers from a legitimate financial institution. These days, many such calls are fraudulent and seek to illegitimately obtain the account holder's personal information. But when customers do not have telephone banking set up, they're often asked a series of security questions in lieu of a passcode or PIN. Even if these questions do not rely on the NRIC, which, as the recent BizFile fiasco has demonstrated, is clearly insecure, the answers to these questions may potentially be obtained by any sufficiently motivated investigator. And on the flip side, it is far from clear how, as customers, we can verify that the caller is indeed from a financial institution. I have, on more than one occasion, challenged an actual call from an officer from my bank, and the absence of equivalent mechanisms to verify the legitimacy of the caller was made amply clear. All this is to say that the SRF, as currently conceived, has offered account holders scant protection from even instances of fraud, even when customers make good faith efforts to protect themselves. What more, scams, which are much more sophisticated in design and target the most vulnerable among us. Hence, there's clearly much more work to be done to protect consumers, and hence the driving motivation for this bill. Now, even so, there are reasons to have reservations about the manner by which the proposed bill goes about the task. One may be uncomfortable specifically with how the bill grants law enforcement an enormous amount of latitude to intervene and restrict what is ultimately a private transaction. Now, while there is no perfect solution, and to be clear, I recognize the well-meaning nature of what is embedded in the bill, I wonder if the law could also exercise flexibility in its application. In particular, is it possible for banks to offer individuals the right to designate a trusted administrator, perhaps a close friend or relative, the full authority to freeze transactions for up to 30 days in lieu of the police? This would be similar in spirit to a grant of a letter of administration, albeit in a more limited sense. It would also essentially be an extension of the existing money lock feature, which already covers 61,000 accounts and 5.4 billion in savings, to designate a third party as an authorized person with the ability to corroborate a genuine withdrawal intent. So, the blurring of lines between scams and fraud means that efforts to tackle the scourge of online and offline thievery requires more innovative mechanisms that account for human psychology and behavior. The ROs put forward by this bill are one way forward. I've expressed some reservations over their intrusiveness and hope that there will be some exit option for those who, ex ante, insist on opting out. I also urge this government to not be content with the measures in this bill alone, but to continue refining the shared responsibility framework to build an ecosystem that is more resilient to scams and fraud. That said, on balance, I support the bill.